Charles took William and Harry home to Highgrove after the funeral. No one could have better understood the pain they were going through than he, and he will have been able to draw on his own experience as they struggled to make sense of all that had happened in the last week. He had never lost a mother, obviously, but he had endured the loss of the man he called his honorary grandfather, and the memory of that dark time, and the feelings of loss that never go away, were all too familiar to him. Charles was not a child when it happened, but Lord Mountbatten's murder was as sudden and violent as Diana's, and Charles had taken a long time to come to terms with it. He was grateful that Tiggy was there to help keep their spirits up and to deal with all the last-minute back-to-school chores. She was a vital ingredient in the mix of sensitive and supportive people the boys had around them at that time. Likewise their PPOs, who were 100% trustworthy, had known them all their lives and were like older brothers. And there were those from the prince's private office, particularly Sandy, who supported them professionally. The staff at Highgrove ensured that life carried on as normal, except that no newspapers were brought into the house. Since Diana hadn't lived at Highgrove for some years, her absence from it was not a constant reminder. From the very start, both boys appeared to be in remarkable control. With school starting just a few days later, they were soon enveloped in their academic and sporting routines, the Barbers taking care of Harry at Ludgrove, and the remarkable Andrew Gailey keeping a close watch on William at Eton. The presence of his grandparents across the bridge was another crucial factor. He became particularly close to the Queen, but also to his grandfather, and their weekly conversations were a source of comfort and inspiration. Another important person who came into their lives after their mother's death was Mark Dyer, an ex-Welsh Guards officer, whom colleagues describe as a Captain Hurricane figure. He was taken on as a male Tiggy. He and Tiggy, who were old friends, were partners in crime and were as devoted to the boys as the boys were to them. But again it is Harry who has the closer bond. Mark had worked as an equerry to the Prince of Wales when the children were younger, and Charles had asked if he could come back to help them through this difficult period. He was a rugby player, a good egg, says one of the Prince's team. He's a very straightforward, hard-drinking, hard-living adventurer, and a great soldier. He was also somebody the princes could relate to at that age. And they remembered him from their childhood when he'd shown them guns and tanks and things and taken them rock climbing. The press thought he was a bad influence, but he did a bloody good job for them. He had huge integrity, and he was around when they needed advice that didn't come from their father. But what probably helped the boys more than anything was having each other. They are such very good friends and so close that even today, the people who work for the princes find it hard to think of them as separate entities. It is a closeness brought about in part because of their unique situation. They grew up not knowing who they could trust, who to attach themselves to, who would be there next week, who would be gone. They were unnerved by the shouting of photographers and the lurid headlines and stories about their mother and father. They had no shortage of love, but life was full of uncertainties. What they could be certain of was each other. And long before their mother's death, the early sibling rivalries and irritations were gone, and they came to rely on each other, almost to parent each other. There was no one else who knew what they knew, who had heard what they'd heard, seen what they'd seen, felt what they had felt. After Diana's death, the bond between them was their lifeline and they clung to it. And despite being the younger, Harry, the more adventurous and outgoing of the two, was as much a support to William as the other way round. On the Monday after the funeral, Tiggy took both boys out to follow the Beaufort hunt on foot. On seeing them arrive at the meet, Captain Ian Farquhar, who as master had known the boys and their father for as long as they had been living at Highgrove, went over to them and, speaking on behalf of the entire field, said very simply, "It's good to see you, sirs. I just want you to know that we are all very, very sorry about your mother. You have our deepest sympathy and we were all incredibly proud of you on Saturday. That's all I'm going to say, and now we're going to get on with the day." "Thank you," said William. "Yes, you're right. We all need to get on with the day." Whether by nurture or nature, both boys had the Windsor ability to keep their emotions hidden. William, in particular, as a teenager, had been embarrassed by some of his mother's public outpourings. By contrast, he had watched his father and the way he conducted himself so stoically, no matter what disaster had befallen him, and his grandmother, whose neutral expression is legendary. The Duke of Edinburgh, another Stoic, had been dismayed by Charles's tears when Lord Mountbatten died, and ever eager to win his father's approval, he has scarcely let an eye well up publicly since. Behind closed doors he is a deeply emotional man who is easily moved to tears, and also to laughter. And behind closed doors the Queen is a delightfully astute and funny woman who inspires utter loyalty and utter devotion. Stoicism, fortitude, self-restraint, all these very British qualities that the Windsors hold so dear are now outdated. But they are the qualities that have made the Queen such a universally loved and admired sovereign. We like the fact that after 60 years on the throne, we still don't know anything about her. We know that she likes dogs, pigeons and horses and that she rides without a hard hat. We know nothing about her politics, her faith, except in broadest outline, her fears or foibles. And because we don't know what she thinks or how she behaves in private, we can't disagree with her or disapprove. We can't take exception or offense as we can with politicians, churchmen, broadcasters, businessmen, footballers and leaders in every field, but we can't take against the Queen. Of course there will be those who ideologically disagree with the institution, but that is different. And usually, even Republicans respect her. We live in a world that is far removed from the Queen's, where celebrities queue up to share their innermost secrets with millions of strangers, and where crying in public is a sign that you care. The public reaction to Diana's death epitomized the new age. Months later, counselors were still treating people unable to come to terms with their grief. Diana had shared her innermost secrets with them, and that was part of her magic and her appeal. The public identified with her suffering and fed from it, just as she was sustained by the love of millions of strangers. But hers was not the only way of communicating. There are many thousands of people who have been visited by the Queen after floods, famines or disasters, who will tell you that she is very far from cold and that the visit did wonders for their morale. But the perception in those touchy-feely days when Diana had such a hold on the world was that the rest of the Windsors were glacial, aloof and out of touch. After Diana's death, the Prince of Wales rightly foresaw a backlash against the royal family and he kept his head below the parapet for several weeks. Indeed, he was terrified of raising it. When he did, it was a visit to Manchester that culminated at a Salvation Army drop-in centre in one of the most notorious estates in the city. No one knew what to expect. His office had written a speech, which he discarded, and acting on instinct, as he often did, he walked into a hall full of cameras and delivered the most touching, brave, tear-jerking tribute to the courage of his sons and to the public, who had shown such kindness in what had been an unbelievably difficult time. He won the respect and sympathy of millions. I think they are handling a very difficult time with enormous courage and the greatest possible dignity, he said. I also want to say how particularly moved and enormously comforted my children and I were, and indeed still are, by the public's response to Diana's death. It has been really quite remarkable and indeed in many ways overwhelming. I think, as many of you will know from experiences of family loss in your own lives, it is inevitably difficult to cope with grief at any time. But you may realize, it is even harder when the whole world is watching at the same time. But obviously the public support, and the warmth of that support, has helped us enormously. I can't tell you how enormously grateful and touched both the boys and myself are. The possibility that he wasn't the bad, uncaring father that Diana had suggested started to dawn and slowly the tide of public opinion began to turn in his favor, but not without a little help. The public knew a great deal about Mrs. Parker Bowles. The princes knew surprisingly little. Their father had never introduced them, aware that they wouldn't welcome it, any more than they had welcomed meeting their mother's paramours. In the summer of 1997, however, 2 months before Diana's death, he broached the subject. He sat them down together and tried to explain a bit about the situation, but the boys were very quiet and William was not at all receptive. He told Tiggy afterwards that William didn't want to know about it, and he sensibly left it. He had also been planning to introduce Camilla to the wider world in September that year. As patron of the National Osteoporosis Society, a disease from which her mother died a most painful death, she was hosting a fundraising party, which the prince was planning to attend. The gradual coming out was being masterminded by Alan Kilkenny, a public relations guru, who had been behind the phenomenally successful Wishing Well appeal for Great Ormond Street Hospital. When the princess died, all plans had to be abolished. Camilla, who was as vilified as Charles at that time, retreated to her Wiltshire home. The monarchy had survived by a hair's breadth. The Queen had redeemed herself with her 11th-hour television tribute, and a long and blameless track record. Charles's fate was still precarious, and as heir to the throne this was a problem. More of a problem was his determination, at all costs, to hang on to Camilla. Through no fault of her own, she had been the cause of monumental upset. The clear solution was to let her go, but Charles wouldn't. She had saved him from the brink of despair. She had given him faith in himself. She was a support he couldn't move forward without. He loved her, and he made it clear that she was non-negotiable. At dinner one night with Camilla's divorce lawyer, Hilary Brown Wilkinson, not long after the Dimbleby debacle, Charles heard the name Mark Bolland for the first time. He was the Canadian-born, comprehensive school-educated, bright, powerful 30-year-old head of the Press Complaints Commission. Hilary suggested a meeting. She thought he could be useful in helping to improve the prince's image. In a maneuver of thinly veiled subterfuge, he arrived in July 1996 as assistant to Sandy Henney, who was then deputy press secretary, and swiftly rose to assistant private secretary, during which process Richard Aylard, who shouldered the blame for having allowed Jonathan Dimbleby into the inner sanctum, was eased out of the top job. Bolland became the prince's golden boy. He dispensed with Kilkenny and took on the task he had been hired to do, that of raising the prince's stock and making Mrs. Parker Bowles acceptable to the British public. It was a challenging task from the beginning, but after Diana's death it was well nigh impossible. But he achieved it, and it was entirely thanks to him that Camilla is now the prince's wife and widely accepted as the Duchess of Cornwall. But that acceptance came at a high price.